welcome to another video. Today we're continuing our topic on sexual reproduction, and today we want to specifically talk about reproductive behavior in flowering plants, and we're talking about pollination. Now, pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from an anther to a receptive stigma. So, in most species of flowering plants, external agents bring about pollination. So flowers have evolved special structures and mechanisms to ensure successful pollination. So pollination is just the transfer of this pollen grains that are in the anther to a receptive stigma that is willing or that is ready to receive the pollen grains, and that leads to fertilization and leads to sexual reproduction. So in most species of flowering plants, it's some external agents that bring about this pollination, some outer agents. So flowers have structures and mechanisms that ensure successful pollination. Now we have two major types of pollination. We have self-pollination and cross-pollination. So the two major types of pollination. So we'll talk about the two of them. We'll start with self-pollination. Now, self-pollination takes place when the pollen grains from the anther of a flower fall on the stigma of the same flower or that of another flower on the same plant. So, self-pollination is when the pollen grains that are coming from the anther of a flower fall on the stigma of that same flower, or they fall on the stigma of another flower on the same plant. Now, this process has a high success rate. Now, self-pollination brings the gametes and egg cells of the same plant together. So, whether it's on the same flower or another flower on the plant, self-pollination is always involved with one plant. So, it brings the gametes, the male gametes, and the egg cells of the same plant together. Now, the offspring that is produced by self-pollination shows very little genetic variation because we are talking about the same plant or the same flower, so there's very little genetic variation. Now, continued self-pollination over many generations will most likely result in weakened individuals because the unfavorable traits will continue being passed down up to the offspring. So it can result in weakened individuals that have several unfavorable traits. So continued self-pollination over many generations or over many years can most likely result in weakened individuals. So that's that about self-pollination. Now let's talk about cross-pollination. So cross-pollination occurs when the mature pollen grains of a flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower another plant, of the flower of another plant of the same or a closely related species. So the pollen grains, mature pollen grains of a flower are transferred to the stigma of a flower of another plant or a plant of the same or closely related species. Now this process is more wasteful than self-pollination because pollen grains may never reach a receptive stigma because the pollen grains are going from one plant to another. So it's not very likely that it's not as likely for the pollen grains to reach the stigma as it is in self-pollination. So cross-pollination brings the male gametes and the egg cells of two different parent plants together. Now, because of this, there is a greater genetic variability among the offspring. Now, the offspring of cross-pollination tend to be healthy and well adapted because there is more variability because if cross-pollination keeps occurring over several generations, several years, plants will keep, for example, if plant A or plant B, the offspring produced from plant A and plant B would get some traits. So the offspring could take favorable traits from A, favorable traits from B, and might have some unfavorable traits too, but as several reproduction goes on over several generations, eventually, when several plants keep reproducing, coming together for cross-pollination, there will be variation, there will be variability and the favorable traits will be passed on, and the offspring produced will be healthy and well adapted. And the seeds also that are produced will be more abundant and viable seeds. Now, both cross-pollination and self-pollination have both advantages and disadvantages. So, as genetic variability is important for the survival of a species, most types of plants have devices that favor cross-pollination. So, because variation is very important for a species to survive, most plants have devices or mechanisms that favor cross-pollination. So, despite these plants having devices or mechanisms that favor cross-pollination, many of them still have devices to bring about self-pollination in case cross-pollination fails. For example, tridacts and hibiscus, they bring about self-pollination. They go through self-pollination in case cross-pollination fails. Now, in some species like the groundnut, self-pollination occurs regularly. It occurs from time to time. In fact, self-pollinating species are usually found in uniform habitats and habitats where animal pollinators are rare. So that the self-pollination can keep occurring over several periods. So some areas where animal pollinators are rare, like the Arctic regions and the areas that are high above sea level. So regions like that, self-pollination is more favorable. So plants are adapted to survive in their habitat. So whether it requires to go through self-pollination or cross-pollination, plants are adapted for wherever they are found so that they can undergo this pollination to ensure the continual survival of that species. So with that, we've come to the end of today's video. In our next video, we'll talk about features favoring self-pollination. Features that are found in a plant that favor self-pollination. So see you in our next video.